We'll restart again this session on semantics, and I'm going to present in this session more about what we do on FAIR in the context of OntoCommons project. My presentation will then be followed by a presentation by Maria Poveda. And so in the OntoCommons context, I mean, OntoCommons is documenting industrial data with ontologies. So one of the crucial aspects to implement FAIR is actually to talk about FAIR semantics. How do we make sure that the ontologies we're going to use and develop for industry are themselves FAIR? So why FAIR semantics? Because if you look at the landscape, right, coming from working on different domains, basically, if you look at the semantics, there are different levels of semantic descriptions, for very weak semantics to very strong semantics. And we see that also in the realm of OntoCommons, where we have top-level ontologies that are highly formalized and domain ontologies that just specialize with not much logic in them sometimes. They come up in different formats. Some of them are coming in RDF XML, some of them are published in Turtle, some of them in OWL, and so on and so forth. They have different names. Some people call them ontologies, controlled vocabulary, thesauri, code lists. They have many names, but they're all ontologies in the end. And if you look at the different communities, each of the communities you will find have their own best practices in order to build their own ontologies, right? And there are different ways of sharing them and publishing them. So basically, if you look at the landscape, it's really hard to find and reuse ontologies within the same domain and across domains. Plus, you get a lot of interoperability problems that you need to solve between these different semantic resources, and that makes it very hard to work with. So in the end, just a summary, basically, currently, semantics is not FAIR. And this is a problem because basically in the FAIR principles, the principle I2 on interoperability states that metadata and data should use vocabularies that follows themselves the FAIR principles, right? So in the end, we are not going to be able to implement FAIR in any context for data as long as we do not make our own vocabularies and ontologies FAIR. So I'm going to start with some work that's been started not in OntoCommons, but in a project before that's called FAIR is FAIR that finished in 2022, where basically we started tackling this issue. How do you make ontologies FAIR? And so we started discussing about what's FAIR semantics. And what it means is that semantic artifacts should adhere to the FAIR principles. And in that context, we consider the ontologies, so the semantic artifacts, as a specific type of data which is used to describe and annotate other data, meaning metadata. And here I'm introducing a new concept, which is semantic artifact. And that concept is a sort of bridge concept that Arco mentioned yesterday, because we had issues when we started discussing and long and useless debates on what's an ontology, what's not. So you always get this debate on our ontologies are pure ontologies and these are the only ontologies, where you get other people that are less formal that says, well, my thesaurus, my controlled vocabulary is also an ontology, and they are both right, but they cannot reconcile. So in order to avoid these endless discussions, we started discussing about finding this bridge concept that we call semantic artifact, which is clearly defined within our work as a machine actionable and readable formalization of a conceptualization, enabling sharing and reuse by humans and machines. These artifacts may have a broad range of formalization, from loose sets of terms, taxonomy, thesauri, to high-order logics. Moreover, semantic artifacts are serialized using a variety of digital representation format, which could be Turtle, OWL, XML, RDF XML, JSON LD, and so on. So, of course, this definition is not necessarily perfect, but at least it allows to actually reconcile the different viewpoints and to start discussing how now we want to make these different FAIR semantic artifacts, FAIR. And so in the context of the FAIR is FAIR project, we established 17 generic recommendations that are all aligned with the individual FAIR principles. and 12 best practices, which are related to, for instance, findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability, but not necessarily directly associated with one of the individual FAIR principles. And we worked extensively with communities by organizing several workshops, and one of these workshops allowed us, with the different communities, to actually align these recommendations with the RFC 2119, where basically we said this recommendation is a must, a should, or a may. And we ended up with 9 recommendations that are a must, which means that's mandatory if you want to be fair, 7 that should be recommended, 1 that is optional, and 1 that was undetermined. And so this work could not be done just in the context of the project, but for some reason it doesn't work. Yeah, so we organized in this context. Fair is Fair was like OntoCommons, a CSA. So we organized several workshops to discuss that with the communities, because the idea is to start breaking the silos of the different communities and start agreeing on common general principles, because whether you're a biomedicine, you're a material science, manufacturing, or any other kind of industry, well, basically you're building an ontology, so it doesn't matter. The domain doesn't really matter here. We want to have fair ontologies across all domains. We also collaborated extensively with the Research Data Alliance, which is a very nice platform to actually have an international outreach. You have a lot of experts coming from Australia, US, China. It's very diverse set of people, and we work with the Vocabulary and Semantic Service Interest Group. So if you're interested, you can come to me. I'm one of the co-chair of that group. And basically, during the regular meetings of RDA, we discussed several aspects, and we created 2 task groups in there. One was led by Clément Jonquet and Luis Bonino on defining a minimum metadata schema for FAIR semantics artifacts, and another group on FAIR semantics repositories to see how these repositories were actually complying with the recommendations we edited in FAIR is Fair. Now, this work also intended not to reinvent the wheel, right? There are already things that exist in different communities, be it biomedical with the OBO Foundry. Now, there is also the industry ontology foundry principles that we looked into. There's also some work from Maria that is going to talk just after me, and also a paper on vocabularies from Simon Cox. So we try to aggregate in this recommendation all this wealth of information and to use them at our own advantage. And so basically, if you want to make semantic artifacts fair, well, you need to use a globally unique, persistent, resolvable identifier, and for that content, which means that it's not just the ontology, but the concept, the class and relations, whatever. The version also should have different grouperies. Of course, you need machine-readable metadata to describe the semantic artifacts themselves and their content. You need to use a repository to share and publish and retrieve these semantic artifacts and their content. And that's the case, for instance, in OntoCommons, we have the industry Onto portal instance. You need to define common APIs to actually access and index the contents of the semantic artifacts. You need to make sure that you use interoperability approaches so that different various degrees of complexity and encoding should work together. And more importantly, that includes publishing mappings and crosswalks between these different artifacts in a fair manner, so that actually what was presented this morning with the presentation of Martin, that you need to have mappings, that's necessary, so you need also to make them fair so that they can be machine actionable. And then one of the other aspects is that semantic artifact and their content should be also retrievable through search engine. So not necessarily Google, but specific search engine would work. Now, what's the link with OntoCommons? Well, in OntoCommons, we were wondering, first, what are the ontologies in the field, right? So, and another question that was directly related is, are these ontologies we're going to find for the context of OntoCommons fair? So the first questions we started to ask is, what are the existing ontologies or vocabulary that are relevant for industry? What are their characteristics? And are they aligned to existing top-level ontologies, which is actually very important for OntoCommons work, because we have this pyramid of top-level ontologies, mid-level ontologies, and domains ontologies. So basically what we started to do at the beginning of OntoCommons is a landscape analysis of domain ontologies for industry. And so how we did that is to actually organize several workshops with experts from different domains related to industry. We also leveraged the internal project knowledge. We have quite a large panel of experts within OntoCommons that we actually poke their brain and say, okay, do you know ontologies in that domain and so on, and collected all that information. And we also launched a survey where we asked the communities to actually provide us with ontologies. So we started building a data set that we cleaned up, and that is published actually. So you have the link here. You have the OntoCommons ontology catalog, so that actually you have access to that content. And it's actually published also in deliverable on Zenodo. So regarding the data sets, we ended up, after getting all the inputs from the different sources, having duplicates. So I think we had more than 200 ontologies in the first pass. When then we started cleaning up that data set, removing duplicates, also removing things that are not directly connected with business and industry, material science, and things like that. So we ended up with 130 ontologies. And then we started classifying these ontologies in 5 domains: physics and chemistry, mechanical and industrial engineering, thermal and process engineering, material science and engineering, and computer science, systems and electrical engineering. We started to analyze the data set, and you can actually find the results of our analysis in a deliverable published on Zenodo. And I realized that I forgot to put the link with the GOI, so I will update my slides so that you can have access to that. And so one interesting fact is that out of these 130 ontologies, you have 84 ontologies that are machine readable. The rest is in PDFs. Papers. So you could find tons of very good ontologies, highly formalized and so on, in papers. You cannot find a machine readable or usable description of that ontology published anywhere. And that is diverse in the different domains, but I'm not going to enter into detail. So we started classifying and looking at the number of ontologies distributed across the five domains. So for instance, mechanical engineering is the one that has the most of ontologies that we found. They have a reasonable ratio of machine readable versus non-machine readable. The one that was actually, and it's really tiny, that had all their ontologies is thermal engineering, where all of them were as PDFs. And then we started to look at various different aspects, and I'm really not going to deep dive into the details because we worked extensively with Arco, looking at the internal logics and so on. But we looked at things like what is the serialization you can find this ontology. Most of them, you have them as RDF XML or in Turtle, few of them in OWL, for instance. And another thing that we actually used, we did, is to work with the industry portal and Mat portal to look at mappings between these ontologies. Some of these ontologies were actually published in these repositories, and these repositories are based on OntoPortal, which includes some mapping tools to automate discovery of mappings, and we realized that a lot of them overlaps with each other. Now, what about fair compliance? So what we started to do is, well, at the point where we started, there was nothing on evaluating the fairness of semantics, right? So what we had at hand were the fair is fair recommendation. That's why I started with these recommendations. So what we did is look at these recommendations, starting to identify the recommendations that targeted directly ontologies or semantic artifact, if you want, and starting to actually define questions, a sort of questionnaire that you would go one ontology after another and start answering this question as a simple yes or no. So we ended up with 13 questions, right? And we had for specific recommendations, sometimes more than one question that would cover that aspect. So for instance, for the globally unique resolvable identifier, you have 3 questions, and then same for provenance. For instance, does the semantic artifact have provenance information? Does it use W3C prov? Does it describe import with provenance? So what we started to do is, well, we have a spreadsheet, the ontologies, the questions, and we started going one ontology after the other manually. So that was kind of tedious work, and starting to fill in the answers with a 0 and 1, yes or no, basically. So, and we established 2 scores. One score, which is what we call the FAIR score, basically gives you the percentage of mandatory recommendations from the FAIR work that are actually fulfilled. And we established another one that says global FAIR score, which is the percentage of all the fulfilled recommendations, whether they're mandatory or recommended. In terms of scoring, if you have one recommendation that has more than one question, you need to fulfill all the questions for that particular recommendations to be actually to be a yes, basically. So it's very stringent evaluation. So we can think about looser evaluations. And so what we did is putting together that beautiful Excel spreadsheet. So still Excel is quite useful. And started looking at the fairness assessment, the results that we had for the different domains. So basically, in physics and chemistry, mechanical and industrial engineering, material science and engineering, computer science, systems and electrical engineering. So at the time, we only had 74 machine actionable ontologies. So we analyzed more than half, 44. And here are the scores, and they're also detailed in the deliverable. Now, what you see is based on that very simple first evaluation. None of the ontologies are fair, and they are far from being fair, right? So there's a lot of work to do. What we noticed is that physics and chemistry is the domain with the highest fair score on average. For instance, the allotrope ontology in the material science domain is actually the most fair ontology we get in our data set. And basically, no ontologies pass the threshold of minimally fair. So that was an interesting exercise. So right after we finished that and we published the first version of the deliverable with this analysis, there is a tool that came out that's called FOOPS, and Maria is going to talk about it. So it makes a nice transition to the next talk, although she's not going to focus mostly on that. There was another tool that came out that is associated with the OntoPortal repository, which is called OFAIR. Basically, these 2 tools use different metrics, using also the FAIR recommendations. Both of them are slightly different in their interpretation. What we noticed is that this questionnaire, although very simple, is actually a great tool to get started on the FAIR journey for semantic artifacts because it asks the right questions. And we tested that with a crowd of people in Montpellier last summer during the Agro Hackathon. And basically, all the people that went through this questionnaire started to think differently about their ontology in terms of the GUPRI, in terms of the metadata, the licensing, and so on. So that helped them to actually start putting together a framework for FAIR ontologies so that then they could use the existing FAIR evaluators to automate the scoring. And they actually increased quite tremendously their score. Now, it's of course incomplete, so because we do not take into account some of the other recommendations on FAIR data maturity, for instance, and so on. And they are based on high-level recommendations. One of the interesting things is that there's no consideration about the metadata content for describing ontology. Although in FAIR is FAIR, that's something we initiated, and I'm going to talk about it maybe later. The fact that, well, FAIR principle says you need to provide rich metadata. It doesn't say how rich you should be, right? So basically, at some point, you need to establish a threshold so that you can evaluate that an ontology or a data set is actually fair based on that minimum metadata that needs to be provided. And so in the second version that is published of the deliverable, we started to do a comparison with the FOOPS service, and we realized that actually they are pretty much aligned in terms of results of evaluation. So I will stop here, and I think I have no time for questions, but if there is one question, please do not hesitate. Question? No? I see no. Yep.
What is your explanation that the ontologies that were found all were not minimally fair? What was the main bottleneck? What do you think?
Some of them didn't have GUPRIs, clear GUPRIs, so either using Perl, a handle. I mean, sometimes it was just a local identifier. Many cases, no provenance at all for the concepts. So in some cases, you see that some of the ontologies import concepts from other ontologies, but they do not provide any provenance on that. So basically, you don't know if that which version of the ontology they were taken up were used. So that's scoring. Some of them didn't have any license at all, so you don't know if you can use it or not. I mean, small issues, but when you start accumulating them, then you realize that you're quite further. And no metadata in many cases. Just forget about ontology metadata. Arco?
Yes, so I just wanted to make a comment, not a question, but you can also comment on what I'm saying. I mean, just wanted to make a reference that, as you already mentioned, that we have used two different fairness tools, fairness evaluation tools. One is from UPM FOOPS, and then another is OFAIR. Mm-hmm. And also there are other fairness evaluation tools. So there is a recent work going on, which you are also part of. I will call that as MetaFair, but the name is not right now decided. But and this study, what we are trying to do is that to compare the strategy different fairness evaluation tools are trying to adopt, and trying to compare them. At the same time, we will have a certain number of ontologies. We will run through these different tools, and then we'll provide a kind of comparative analysis. In the long term of the second version of this work, we were trying to create this kind of aggregated fair scoring tool, which probably we will call MetaFair or something like that. And I believe that that will be a really good contribution in terms of kind of unifying or harmonizing all these different fairness evaluation strategy. And then, I'll expect you also comment something on that. And also Maria, if you want to comment.
So I was supposed to make a comment, but I forgot. So thanks for complimenting my. So indeed, there is some work that we're doing because there are divergences in the way to do the evaluation in the different tools, which makes things a bit difficult, especially in the industrial context, because you need to know actually which one you should use, and not, I have two choices. I don't know, right? So what we're trying to do is to harmonize now, indeed, the evaluators to actually converge into a common matrix, which will make things simpler, at least for the evaluation of semantic artifacts. So thanks, Arco, for pointing that out.
Online questions, can you unshare this?
Yes. And then chat, right?
So it's not a question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so there is a comment from Susanna on the fact that there are 20 different fair evaluation tools. So, and thank you for pointing out the fair metrics. And we are supposed to have a presentation of the FAIR Metrics Task Force after our talk. So thanks, Susanna. Now I think I will give the floor to Maria for the second talk. Let me see. So well, you can keep with 20. If we go a little bit overboard, that's okay. So, and then you need to share here, but you need to share this one. And then you will do this. Does it work? Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, yeah. So thanks, Yann and Joanna and Monica for inviting me. So I'm going to, well, I was going to talk about the FAIR assessment, but we have a session tomorrow, so I prefer to focus on something related with what Yann presented and the fact that many communities have been working in kind of FAIR data, maybe calling with different names, and how can we converge with our practices. And this is also related to, I think, Rod's presentation, who also make the distinctions between the linked open data and FAIR and so on. So you will find connections here. Well, I didn't mention I'm an associate professor at the Polytechnic University of Madrid, and my background is mostly in ontology engineering and ontology development. So I think I'm going to skip some slides because there has been many introductions already to this. But I wanted to mention, as in Rod's presentation, that there is FAIR data which has some characteristics. Another thing is open data. Some FAIR data could be open, but it's not necessarily open, as he mentioned. And we also have linked data that could also be FAIR or open, but not necessarily everything at the same time. So there are the different requirements here. Well, I don't need also to introduce ontologies and semantic resources as research outputs. We are all here in the same page, and we know that we should be treating ontologies as we treat data and trying to make them also FAIR. So what I want to mention is, or to present, is a work that we did 3 years ago, in which we took Yann's recommendations from First FAIR project, these 17 recommendations about how to make ontologies FAIR. But we said, wait, this is not new for us. In the semantic web community, we had already good best practices to follow, and some of them, many of them, are related to the FAIR principles. So, well, I forgot to mention, we map the first FAIR recommendations to the FAIR principle, taking the deliverable and also adding some comments and analysis on that. But we also look at the semantic web and ontology engineering work that was previously done. So we took also the paper that Yann mentioned, the best practices for implementing FAIR vocabularies and ontologies on the web, that provides you 10 guidelines for FAIR ontologies. And we map also these recommendations to the FAIR principles. But we also look at what was going said in the semantic web and the link open data community before the FAIR principles arrive. So indeed, we have the 5-star, well, the linked data have the 5-star system for measuring how good is your data or how open. But this star system, that your vocabulary get more stars as you are meeting more requirements, are also only for ontologies. And there are two systems. One from Bernard Batant, who was one of the creators of the link open vocabularies, the registry that you probably know for where you look for ontologies. So it was created by Bernard and Pierre-Yves, and Bernard provided this 5-star system saying how to nicely publish your vocabulary. And after that, we also had a 5-star system from the Semantic Web Journal. This is a paper, a short paper in this journal, and they also tells you more or less the same characteristics about how to make your vocabulary well published. And I put the red lines for the common points. As you can see, it's more or less, we are talking more or less about the same in different ways. Make it open, making stable, which is also kind of permanent, identified, provide metadata, provide machine readable, provide human readable version, reuse other elements from other vocabulary. So my talk today is about also reuse someone else's practices and technologies who are already there. And yeah, we also took these two systems and aligned them to the FAIR principles. So we end up with this matrix for how the FAIR principles are related to the semantic web best practices. And well, we can see that there are some points without convergence, because there are some practices in the semantic web that doesn't really fit with the FAIR principle. So one of them is like the metadata and the data is linked, and they both exist, because when we build ontologies, and I mean ontologies in the semantic web, that means using OWL, not any other ontology language that we have from, I don't know, 30 years ago, and they are still ontologies. When I talk about ontologies here, I mean for the semantic web. And here we have the ontology metadata embedded in the ontology file. So everything is together. So we are not that used at providing metadata files and linking to the actual resource. I'm not saying that that is wrong. I'm saying that the fact that we do the other way is not wrong either. So we don't really, we cannot say that our ontology is not fair just because there is no some other file having one more redirection to the file. Then we cannot say that that's not fair, because you can be fair and efficient as well, having everything together. Another point is FAIR makes many comments about the protocol, and for us that is one of the pillars. We are using HTTP and HTTPS protocol, and we are not going to reinvent technology here. So if someone wants to build a new protocol, brace yourself and get it right, because it is very difficult to make people to adopt new technologies rather than reuse what is there and is working. And also, there is another point about making, I like this point, making the metadata available, even though when the results is not available anymore, because for us in the web community is like we live with things disappearing, and is one of the difficulties of our research and our life. But I can see, and that's why I say that this is a conversation between different communities, because when I talk to librarians, archivists, they want to have everything stored just for the record, but that doesn't happen on the web. So I wouldn't say, oh, you are not fair because you stop maintaining your ontology, but I want to have a record to see that that existed, because if I can't find the code, it's like having the paper. I'm not going to reuse it. So why do I want the registry for? So, well, that like the main disagreement, but this work was about, okay, from the semantic web community, we can tell you what you can reuse and don't reinvent, because as I mentioned, many communities are working about the same things in different ways. But we also identify needs for us. Maybe some biologists, librarians, and other communities have some practices because they are very organized that we don't have because we are loose and lazy, I don't know, and also some points for discussion. But if I talk about everything, we never finish, so I will just mention the first column, give from the semantic web, and if you spot some topic that you want to discuss later, I will be around here and tomorrow. So, for the fair aspect, so we always say, okay, fair tells you to use GUPRIs, and we have URIs, and I want to understand that GUPRIs, the U in GUPRI mean unique in the sense that your identifier only identifies one thing, because if you pretend to have only one identifier in the world for that thing, that is impossible in the semantic web. We have the non-unique naming assumption, and we assign URIs, and you can have 20 URIs for one resource. So if we understand that unique means one identifier identifies only one thing, we have URIs. If it is the other meaning, we have a problem because the U in URI comes from uniform and is not from unique. That sometimes there is a confusion there. As I mentioned, metadata is normally included in the ontology and is handy. It could be a problem if the ontology is too big, but there are technical solutions for that too. And yeah, maybe we'll also have metadata resources like DCAT or also MOD ontology now. Yeah, maybe we should think about, do we need minimum metadata guidelines that are really minimum, not like the ones that we have now? And yeah, maybe we can discuss about persistence, but because on the web we live in the wild and we don't care much about that. Of course, from the protocol, we use HTTP, HTTPS. We are building the semantic web on top of the document web of documents, and that works. And if you need an authorization or so on the top, you can still build it on top of HTTP. Maybe we have an issue here and we will need preservation policies. So it would be nice people saying, okay, this is my ontology, this is my results, and I will keep it for this time. After that, I can claim it will be there because we don't do that, and it could be nice to adopt that from other communities that I said they are very, well organized, not like us. Yeah, when the FAIR principle mentioned use, standard formats and knowledge representation and so on, it's like, yeah. So we all use RDF, OWL, SCOS, standard technologies and standard vocabularies. We do have the methods to reuse ontologies, and just the fact that we have the OWL import or just to refer to someone else's URI is great, because also we can map all the URIs that we want using axioms, and that everything is that explicitly in the file in a machine-readable way. So we should keep that. And of course, the mechanisms to the needs, the methods to reuse ontologies are really related to the mechanisms about how to do that. Yeah, as this, oh, sorry. Oh, something happens. Well, as this work is from 3 years ago, we didn't have indicators, but as Yann mentioned, they started with the spreadsheet because we didn't have indicators, but there are news there. I wanted to mention in the not too forced to reuse FAIR vocabularies, it's just, it's not so important. The thing is, if you say that an ontology, to be fair, has to reuse a FAIR ontology, then you will have a problem because which will be the first vocabulary to be reused that makes the others fair. So at some point, there will be some ontologies that are not reusing other ontologies because they are the first ones. So I will not be so critical in that point. Yeah. And regarding the reusability, well, as I mentioned here, in the link open data, in order to be load, you have to be open. So FAIR means that you have a license. That doesn't mean that it is open. So we are more restricted there. And the good thing is that we include links to the URI within the ontology metadata, and it actually can be also described in RDF. So the license itself is machine readable and actionable, which is a step forward, I think, in this case. And of course, we have the provenance ontology to annotate all our resources with standard ontologies to provide the provenance, so that we also use standards there. But it is true that in this case, we could really benefit from community standards for like OBO. I think they have very well-known guidelines. Yeah. So as I mentioned before, there are good news in the indicator from assessing ontologies, FAIR ontologies. And normally, when we do the fair assessment is normally when we have our results, resource probably published, and then when it is somewhere, we say, now we are going to see how fair it is. And for doing this, tomorrow we will have a demo on FOOPS that is just a simple, very simple interface. You just put your ontology URI and gives you the results, similar to Jan's spreadsheet, but in HTML and with the explanation. This is just a screenshot for tomorrow. This is not exactly a materials portal because I couldn't get the screenshot, but is this portal that is for AgroPortal. It has the same implementation of offer that we will also see tomorrow. And now I would like to think or to give some insight about the ongoing work. Like, okay, instead of evaluating the ontologies once they are done, what could be doing from the beginning so that they are fair when you arrive to the assessment and don't have to come back and do some more work? So that is mostly during the implementation and the publication, but I'm currently analyzing methodologies and aspects to provide some guidelines for this. So when we are conceptualizing, there is no code. For me, I normally use these UML-alike diagrams, and I have choke to transform these diagrams into OWL code. So the thing is, okay, I can generate my implementation easier, but the value here is not getting to the OWL code very soon, but to make very precise diagrams that I can include later in the documentation so that the people can understand the ontology without open the full code in a text editor or going to Protégé and then move from one tab to another tab. So at least in my case, if I have to reuse an ontology and the authors give me this kind of diagram, it is more likely that I'm going to keep looking at it and trying to understand it. And that makes it really more reusable, providing a human readable documentation as visualizations. During the encoding, these are taken from the guidelines from Garijo and myself. And then you should be providing metadata to describe the ontologies. And here there is a list of which properties you should be providing and exactly which term from which ontology you should be using. For example, to declaring the license, then you can use DC terms license. But there are many properties to declare the license, and then you can go to the MOD ontology that have all the terms and all the mappings between them. This is just a suggestion. Actually, we're analyzing how many times its property appears to convert them and have like templates for people to say, okay, we don't say that this is the best one, but it's what others are using, so try to harmonize everything. And still we have the mappings. Of course, that is for ontologies, but of course, for each term, we should be providing human-oriented documentation, and lists, labels, and comments. And during the encoding, also, we should be thinking which is our ontology name, which is the prefix, are we going to use hash, URIs, or slash identifiers? Are we going to have meaningful or opaque URIs? How are we going to version the ontologies? Are we going to assign one DOI to each version or one from the general one and then list the versions? And how to ensure permanent URIs. So here you have some examples of these points. And that is something that affects the publication, but that you should be thinking in the encoding because it affects the ontology, the URIs for all the elements. Of course, during the implementation, you should be reusing other ontologies to maximize the interoperability, but well, there are a huge discussion there too. Once we have the code of the ontology, we should document it, and this is where we are generating HTML documentation and where I really encourage people to include diagrams of the model and diagrams for the example data. How do I generate a sample data following this ontology? Because otherwise it's quite hard. Also, if you can provide the Sparkle queries together with your ontology, is great. Probably they are not going to fit my use case, but I have something to copy and paste and modify, and at least I will not fight the prefix matching again. And well, when we are publishing the ontology, we need to provide different formats in terms of oriented to humans, then HTML, if you want to provide a PDF or something, diagrams, and oriented to machines. And once we go to the machines, we can also provide different formats like RDF XML, JSON LD, Turtle, I'm finishing. And we do that using content negotiation. So that is already invented for the web. We are not generating a new protocol to say, give me the PDF, the HTML, or give me the Turtle, because that already exists. And of course, make your ontology findable, so you can index in existing portals, but also generating your own portals for your project, for your company. And just to wrap up on time, I would like to mention that metadata is one of the requirements to produce fair ontologies, and so many times the conversation rounds about metadata all the time, but it is not the only point to provide metadata, and that we should be reusing not only the other ontologies, but also the existing practices and the technologies that are already there on the web. And that they think that the FAIR principles, you should think about that in all stages, not only at the end. And don't forget that the FAIR principles, and none of them looks inside the resource. It's all about the wrapping around, putting a nice envelopment, but there is nothing about the quality on of the resource. So you can have a perfectly fine fair ontology that is not useful for anyone. So I will say that you can be, I'm not going to make friends here, just fair enough. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Maria. Question for Maria? Time for a quick question.
One is
scared now. You
too much
scared them off.
information.
No,
Fair
it's
enough.
interesting to see the link between the FAIR principles and the semantic web. So when you read the FAIR principles, they all align with semantic web practices, with more or less some adjustment, but indeed, you can actually use all the framework, that's what you just showed, or the framework of the web to actually implement the FAIR principles. So that's nice to actually just see that mapping, because that's not often you see it. Now, indeed, I mean, my vision for FAIR is a lot turns around metadata, and that's really the missing bricks in semantics. It's like there's no common vocabulary to express or detailed metadata. So you're proposing some elements. There are a few other models, but many of them are not maintained anymore. So I think that's time for harmonizing all that landscape.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of metadata, probably the MOD people can tell a lot about the harmonizing that.
Yeah.
What we were doing was trying to put together properties that were used here and there. Like, okay, people is normally using this, just keep on that. But that also have I will say, has drawbacks, because I don't know if we are using very precisely Dublin core. So I think that was thought for something else. And sometimes we adopt some vocabularies and use it in a different context. Somehow it's like, well done for the reuse, but I don't know if it follows really the original descriptions, but at least.
Yeah, I mean, Dublin Core was for books and publications, not ontologies. So you can certainly make some alignments, but you will be always on the edge of the definition, right? But it's a commonly used vocabulary. If everybody uses that, that makes our life simpler for searching things, right? Thank you, Maria. So if there's no question, I don't see any question in the chat, then I will invite